Okay, so we are looking at Sidney's apology. Sidney has been examining the different genres of poetry one after another, and trying to establish that none of these genres of poetry is disliked or is responsible for the bad reputation of poetry. So after pastoral, he comes to examine the comic. After examining elegiac, satirical and pastoral, he says, Est ulubris animus si nos non deficit equus, quoting from Horace's Epistles. Even in the unpleasant town of Ulubri, happiness may be found if we have calm and equable mind. So his point is that calm and equable mind is what we look for, we should look for, and we should avoid folly, and in that satire helps us. And then he asks, is it the comic which is responsible for the bad reputation of poetry? Perchance it is the comic whom naughty playmakers and stage keepers have justly made odious. To the argument of abuse I will answer after. So the allusion is to Stephen Gosson's book School of Abuse, which criticized the theatre, and he says that comedy also has social value. That comedy is an imitation of the common errors of our life, which he represented in the most ridiculous and scornful sort that may be, so as it is impossible that any beholder can be content to be such a one. As in geometry, the oblique is known by the right, as in arithmetic, the odd as well as the even, so in the actions of our life, who seeth not filthiness of evil, wanted the great foil to perceive the beauty of virtue. So, in comedy, evil or follies of men are represented so that people may perceive what is virtue by contrast. This does the comedy handle so in our private and domestical matters, as with hearing it we get an experience what is to be looked for of a niggardly Demia, of a crafty Debus, of a flattering Gnatho, of a vainglorious Thraso. He is alluding to different comic characters. Each of the characters has a particular fault. So these are mostly from Terence. Demia is a miserly father in Terence's Adolphe. Debus is a tricky servant in his play Andrea. Gnathos is a hanger-on in Eunuchus, and Thraso is a character who is a military braggart in Terence's play Eunuchus. So these characters are taken from mainly Adelphi, Andrea and Eunuchus, three plays by Terence. The dramatist is Terence, and the plays referred to here are Adelphi, Eunuchus and Andrea. So in this kind of classical comedy, type characters were used. So either the miser or the tricky servant or the military braggart they are all type characters. And little reason has any man to say that men learn evil by seeing it to set out. Since, as I said before, there is no man living but by the force truth hath in nature. No sooner seeth these men play their parts, but wisheth them in pistrinum. So Sidney says that people do not learn to do evil by seeing such examples, because people always carry with them the faults of others as well as their own faults. So men play their parts, but when they see others, when they see evil people, but they wish such evil people to be in pistrinum. In pistrinum means in a mill, a trade mill. So here Sidney is alluding to the story in Aesop's Fables, where a man would be seen with two sacks. One sack contained his own faults and another sack contained other people's faults. So in any case, those who contain some grain like mustard or something for pounding them in the mill, they carry them in a sack. So here Sidney suggests that, like in Aesop's Fables, everybody carries with him his own faults and other people's faults, and they should all be pounded in the mill. Although perchance the sack of his own faults lies so behind his back that he seeth not himself to dance the same measure. So people always think that other people will be punished for their faults, but they cannot see their own faults, which they are carrying in a sack, but it is behind the other sack. So they cannot see it and cannot realize that they will also be equally punished because of their own faults. But yet nothing can more open his eyes than to find his own actions contemptibly set forth. But if his own actions are represented in the theatre, in comedy, then he recognizes his faults and his eyes are opened. So this is the use of comedy. And then he says, tragedy can be said to be faulty or to be bad, even less. Nobody be blamed, and much less of the high and excellent tragedy that openeth the greatest wounds and showeth forth the ulcers that are covered with tissue, that maketh kings fear to be tyrants, and tyrants manifest their tyrannical humours. So in tragedies we always see tyrants are punished. So tyrants are afraid to be tyrannical when they observe or watch tragedies. That with stirring the effects of admiration and commiseration teacheth the uncertainty of this world, and upon how weak foundations gilded roofs are builded. So tragedy shows that people build empires or wealth and think that they are secure, but their foundations are on very shaky grounds, weak foundations. That maketh us know, quis sceptra sebus duro imperio regit, timet timentes metus in auterum redit. Fair seek not to be feared, most lovely beloved by thy servants, for true it is that they fear many whom many fear. So these two lines, they mean that the tyrants, they themselves are afraid. Those who are feared by many, inwardly they themselves are afraid. And he gives the example of the tyrant Alexander Ferius, who by watching a tragedy started weeping, recognizing his own faults. So Sidney has established that tragedy is also of much value, and it has a moving power, and therefore it cannot be bad. Is it the lyric that most displeaseth, who with his tuned lyre and well-accorded voice giveth praise, the reward of virtue to virtuous acts, who giveth moral precepts and natural problems, who sometimes raiseth up his voice to the height of the heavens in singing the lauds of the immortal God? So the lyric expresses the praise of God, it gives moral precepts, it praises virtue, and so on. Therefore, how can such lyric poetry be responsible for any kind of bad or evil things, evil effect? So he says that he refers to the ballad of Chevy Chase, a ballad named Chevy Chase, which was a very popular ballad and probably written by some Welsh fiddler, as Sidney says, some Welsh poet, rural poet, but it was very popular and good. And Sidney says that whenever I hear the song of Percy and Douglas, I found not my heart moved more than with a trumpet, and yet it is sung by some blind crowder with no rougher voice than rude style, and it is no less than the writing of Pindar. So Sidney's point here is that popular lyrics or ballads, they have a great moving power. Then then comes the question of epic poetry, heroic poetry, which was considered in the Renaissance to be the best kind of poetry. There rests the heroical, whose very name should daunt all backbiters. For by what conceit can a tongue be directed to speak evil of that which draweth with it no less champions than Achilles, Cyrus, Aeneas, Turnus, Tydeus, and Rinaldo? So in epic poetry we see the representation of such great heroes. Achilles we find in Homer, Cyrus in Xenophon, Aeneas in Virgil, Turnus in Virgil, Tydeus in Statius. Statius's epic poem was called by Rinaldo from Ariosto and Tasso, who does not only teach and move to a truth, but teacheth and moveth to the most high and excellent truth. So Sidney goes on to repeat that poetry both teaches and moves us toward the highest truth or excellent truth, who maketh magnanimity and justice shine through all misty fearfulness and foggy desires. Who, if the saying of Plato and Tully be true, that who could see virtue would be wonderfully ravished with the love of her beauty, this man sets her out to make her more lovely in her holiday apparel, to the eye of any that will deign not to disdain until they understand. So, epic poetry, if we believe Plato and Cicero, then one is ravished with the representation of virtue in epic poetry. But if anything be already said in the defense of sweet poetry, all concurrent to the maintaining the heroical, which is not only a kind but the best and most accomplished kind of poetry. So all Renaissance critics believed that the epic was the highest kind of poetry, excepting Castelvetro. Italian critic. All other Renaissance critics believed epic poetry to be the highest kind of poetry. So Sidney gives the example of Aeneas, how Aeneas obeys the god's commandment to leave Dido, though not only all passionate kindness but even the human consideration of virtuous gratefulness would have craved other of him. How in storms, how in sports, how in war, how in peace, how a fugitive, how victorious, how deceased, and so on. So, by representing Dido in various calamitous situations, Virgil has represented a great hero. And Sidney quotes Horace saying, Melius Chrysippo et Crantore, that is, Homer was better than the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus and Crantor, who were commentators on Plato, Crantor. So, Horace's praise of Homer. So in this way, by examining all the different genres of poetry, Sidney comes to the conclusion that that even when we examine the different parts of poetry, we see that these are noble, helpful, and elevate man, and therefore the poet should triumph. The poet is the best teacher who moves one to the highest truth. Then comes the refutation part, which is one of the parts of oration according to Cicero, where Sidney refutes the claims against poetry. But because we have ears as well as tongues, and that the lightest reasons that may be will seem to be weigh greatly, if nothing be put in the counterbalance, let us here ponder what objections be made against this art. So, who object to poetry? They are the haters of poetry, and Sidney uses a Greek word meaning poetry haters. Miso musoi. Miso means one who hates. In Greek, like philo means one who loves. So miso, musoi, that is one who hates poetry. Muse, plural, musoi. So of the contrary side, if we will turn Ovid's verse, ut latiat virtus proximate mali, that good lie hid in nearness of the evil. So Sidney says that if poetry is said to be evil by the poet haters, then let us think of Ovid's verse, where Ovid says that good lies hidden in the nearness of evil. This is from Ovid's Amatoria. Agrippa will be as merry in showing the vanity of science as Erasmus was in commenting of folly. Neither shall any man or matter escape some touch of the smiling railers. So everything, Sidney says, is uncertain in this world, which has been pointed out by Cornelius Agrippa, the Renaissance philosopher, thinker, Cornelius Agrippa, wrote a book, De Incertitudine et Vanitate Scientiarum et Artium. Wrote a book on the uncertainty and vanity of the sciences and the arts. So this strong skeptic tradition of looking at all sciences, all disciplines as uncertain and therefore vain. Similarly, Sidney points at Erasmus's praise of folly, which was another satirical work, where Erasmus pointed out that there is folly in everything, there is folly in every profession, in all kinds of people, there is some kind of folly. So these skeptical books or satirical books, they refute the idea that there can be any substantial eternal truth, because everything is uncertain, all knowledge is uncertain according to the skeptical tradition. But for Erasmus and Agrippa, they had another foundation than the superficial part would promise. Marry these other pleasant fault finders who will correct the verb before they understand the noun, and confute others' knowledge before they confirm their own. I would have them only remember that scoffing cometh not of wisdom. So as the best title in true English they get with their merriments is to be called good fools. So Sidney says that those who scoff at others, those who criticize others, those who call the poets liars, they are themselves fools. In English, they can be said to be great fools because they try to refute other people's knowledge before they confirm their own knowledge. And then he comes to the objection to rhyming and versification. That which giveth greatest scope to their scorning humours is rhyming and versing. It is already said, it is not rhyming and versing that maketh poesy. So people criticize poetry because of its rhyming. But rhyming and versification are superficial aspects of poetry. They are not essential to poetry. And in this idea, Sidney is following the Italian critic Minturno, and he is going against the ideas of the French Renaissance critic Scaliger. So as I told you that in the 16th century there were many important literary critics in Europe, in Italy and France. So the names that I am taking now, Minturno, Scaliger, Castelvetro, they were all important neoclassical critics, and Sidney read most of them. So he is following here Minturno in the idea that versification is not essential to poetry. Therefore, if you blame poetry as versification, as mere verse, mere rhyming lines, then you miss the actual essence of poetry. And then he says that, but we do not altogether throw out versification and rhyming because they present language in rare harmony. So rhyming and versification also have their qualities. But lay aside the just praise it hath by being the only fit speech for music. Thus much is undoubtedly true that if reading be foolish without remembering, memory being the only treasurer of knowledge, those words which are fittest for memory are likewise most convenient for knowledge. So verses are very convenient because they can be memorized very well. And since we treasure our knowledge in memory, therefore versification helps us in memorizing and remembering things. Lastly, Even they that have taught the art of memory have showed nothing so apt for it as a certain room divided into many places. So Sidney here is alluding to the Renaissance art of memory. In the art of memory, anything that one wanted to memorize, say a long oration, the person would make a mental map or a picture, say of a palace, and think of the palace having a great number of rooms, and he will deposit different parts of the orations in different rooms, and as he goes through that mental map of the palace from room to room, he will remember all the parts of the oration one after another. So I am making a very simplified rendering of the Renaissance art of memory. So Sidney here is alluding to this. But what needed more in a thing so well known to all men? Who is it that ever was a scholar that does not carry away some verse of Virgil, Horace or Cato, which in his youth he learned and even to his old age served him for hourly lesson? So everybody who learns some poems in his youth remembers them even in his old age, and they still serve him some purpose. This was also a conscious practice in the Renaissance of remembering particular lines or appropriate lines from different poets and authors, and the student would write them down in a copybook, which was known as the commonplace book. So imagine these quotations could be written down thematically, theme-wise. So on the theme of death, for example, one would write down some famous lines from Homer, from Virgil, and from other writers. And thus, in the commonplace book, one would have a storehouse of important sayings on different themes. And when one would try to write something of one's own, then one would go back to the commonplace book and find the appropriate quotations from there and incorporate that in his writing. That is why we see in the writings of 16th and 17th century authors that mostly they are full of quotations from Greek and Roman writers because of this practice of commonplace book. And we know that Francis Bacon used to keep a commonplace book, John Milton used a commonplace book, and even today Milton's commonplace book can be seen in the National Library in England. So Sidney says that poetry always helps one through memory or by writing down in the commonplace books. One remembers famous lines. Per cantatorem fugito nam garulum idem est. An inquisitive man is a prattler. This is from Horace. Dum sibi quisque placet credula turba sumus. It is from Ovid. While each pleases himself, we are a gullible set. So these lines from Horace and Ovid are very useful and appropriate. But the fitness it hath for memory is notably proved by all delivery of arts, wherein for the most part from grammar to logic, mathematics, physics and the rest, the rules chiefly necessary to be borne away are compiled in verses. So here Sidney's point is that the verses help us to remember very thoroughly, and that is why even rules of mathematics or grammar, they are compiled in verses. So those who are familiar with old grammar books or say Sanskrit grammar books, the The rules of grammar are given in Sutra. Sutra was a verse, a quotation, which would easily one remember easily, as well as the grammatical rule will be contained in that. So that verse being in itself sweet and orderly and being best for memory, the only handle of knowledge, it must be in jest that any man can speak against it. So even though Sidney says that versification is not the essence of poetry, but he goes a great length to praise versification, as you can see. Then he refers to the four chief objections to poetry. These are: first, there being many other more fruitful knowledges, a man might better spend his time in them than in this. Secondly, that it is the mother of lies. Thirdly, that it is the nurse of abuse, infecting us with many pestilent desires, with a serene sweetness, drawing the mind to the serpent's tail of sinful fancies. And here especially, comedies give the largest field to hear. How both in other nations and in ours, before poets did soften us, we were full of courage given to martial exercises and so on. So what are the objections against poetry? That it is useless, that it is false, it is corrupting, it has a corrupting effect, and lastly and chiefly they cry out with an open mouth as if they had outshot Robin Hood, that Plato banished them out of his commonwealth. So that was the greatest condemnation of poetry, that Plato banished the poets from his commonwealth. And Sidney answers these objections one after another, because this is the refutation section of this oration. First to the first, that a man might better spend his time is a reason indeed, but it doth but peteria principium, for if it be, as I affirm, that no learning is so good as that which teacheth and moveth to virtue, and that none can both teach and move thereto so much as poesy, then is the conclusion manifest, that ink and paper cannot be to a more profitable purpose employed. So the objection that poetry is useless, Sidney says, it is begging the question. Peterio principi means begging the question. That is, the question itself, the issue itself is questionable. Question here is used in the Latin sense, the scholastic sense of quaestio, theme or an issue. So, Peterio principi means begging the question. The very theme that poetry is useless, this theme, this quaestio, is being questioned by Sidney. Because instead of being useless, poetry teaches the best by moving man to the highest truth, therefore it is the most useful. The second, that they should be the principal liars, I answer paradoxically, but truly that of all writers under the sun, the poet is the least liar. And this argument is very interesting. Sidney says that the poet does not lie, because the poet does not make any truth claim. Unlike other sciences like history or philosophy, other disciplines that make truth claims, that is, whatever they say they are stating the truth. Poetry never says that it is stating the truth. Poetry says that whatever it states is fiction. So how can it lie? Now for the poet, he nothing affirms and therefore never lies. So since the poet does not affirm anything, he never lies. And here also Sidney is following Minturno. The poet never maketh any circles about your imagination, to conjure you to believe for true what he writes. Making a circle, it is an allusion to the practice of the magicians. The magicians would draw a circle on the ground with a stick or something in which his magic will operate. Outside the circle, his magic will not work. So Sidney says that that poetry or poets, they never draw a circle in your imagination. They never say that beyond this confined narrow circle, your imagination won't work or poetry won't work. He cited not authorities of other histories, but even for his entry, followed the sweet muses to inspire into him a good invention. In truth, not laboring to tell you what is or is not, but what should or should not be. So, invention is a logical term. Invention of arguments. So, poetry praise to the muses for inspiring, for inspiration and for good invention. And poetry never says, never tells you what is or is not, but what should or should not be. So poetry points to an ideal world, not the actual world. So in the ideal world we can imagine what should be or what should not be. And Sidney says that that is much more important than the actual world, description of the actual world, because the actual world is always imperfect. But we should try to imagine what is perfect, what is better. And therefore, as in history, looking for truth, they may go away full fraught with falsehood. So in poesy, looking for fiction, they shall use the narration but as an imaginative ground plot of a profitable invention. So in history, one would assume that everything is true, but will be often misled with false statements, whereas in poetry one would expect that everything is imaginary, but would often find a lot of useful statements. The poets give names to men they write of, which argue the conceit of an actual truth, and so not being true proves a falsehood. So poet gives names to their characters, and it is like painting men, Sidney says. Painting men, they cannot leave men nameless. So when Xenophon creates the character Cyrus in his work, he is not describing the actual Cyrus, but he is describing an ideal Cyrus. Therefore it is like painting. But when you paint something, you must give it a name. So Xenophon gives it the name Cyrus. The poet named Cyrus or Aeneas no other way than to show what men of their fames, fortunes and estates should do. So either Virgil or Xenophon, when they are painting a hero like Cyrus or Aeneas, they are not describing actual men, but they are describing how men like these, heroes like these should behave. And then on the question of immorality in poetry, which was a major objection of Plato, Sidney says that for immorality, the art itself is not to be blamed, but the artist or the author. The third is how much it abuses men's wit, training it to wanton sinfulness and lustful love. They say the comedies rather teach than reprehend amorous conceits. They say the lyric is larded with passionate sonnets. The elegiac weeps the want of his mistress. Even the heroical Cupid has ambitiously climbed. So love is a common subject in poetry, but it is represented as lust. But who is to be blamed for that? Sidney says, I say whatsoever they will have granted, that not only love but lust, but vanity, but scurrility, possesseth many leaves of the poet's books. Yet think I, when this is granted, they will find their sentence may with good manners put the last words foremost, and not say that poetry abuses man's wit, but that man's wit abuses poetry. So Sidney says, you bring the last word to the front, and you do not say poetry abuses man's wit, but bring this wit forward to the front. Wit, man's wit abuses poetry. Therefore you hold the man responsible, the author responsible, not the art of poetry. Sidney draws a distinction between making likenesses which are good and making likenesses which are bad, and says that with his wit, with his intelligence, imagination, man can in poetry either create figures which are good, or create figures which are evil. So he calls poetry which is eikastike, he uses two Greek words, making likenesses, art of making likenesses is eikastike, art of making likenesses, and art of making phantasms or appearances is fantastike. So fantasies are, Sidney says, it infects the fancy with unworthy objects. As the painter that should give to the eye either some excellent perspective or some fine picture fit for building or fortification, or containing in it some notable example, may leave those and please an ill-pleased eye with wanton shows of better hidden matters. So a painter can paint either noble examples like Abraham sacrificing Isaac, or Judith killing Holofernes, David fighting with Goliath. So these are noble examples of good men fighting evil. Or a painter can describe scenes of lust. So Sidney says that making of appearances that is good is eikastike, and making of false appearances or appearances which are unworthy, that is fantastic. But what shall the abuse of a thing make the right use odious? Just because one is using an art in a way that is an abuse, will the art itself be hateful? So if one does not use poetry in the proper way, but abuses it by describing lust, then we cannot blame poetry for that. Do we not see the skill of physic, the best rampire to our often assaulted bodies, being abused, teach poison, the most violent destroyer? So a physician, a doctor, who uses medicine to cure us and save our lives, the same doctor can use drugs to poison somebody or kill somebody, but then that will be an abuse of his art. We cannot blame the art for that. Then the complaint that poetry effeminates a man, it is a stock complaint, and certain it is that in our plainness, homeliness, yet never was the Albion nation without poetry. Therefore, this complaint that poetry effeminates man is not to be taken seriously, because poetry can also make a man martial or excel in military virtue. And Sidney gives the example from Horace, Jubeo stultum esse libenter. I bid him cheerfully remain a fool. For as poetry itself, it is the freest from their objection, for poetry is the companion of the camps. So, poetry is often a companion of soldiers in the camps. Then he goes on to further elaborate how poetry was the companion of war heroes in a war. Orlando Furioso or honest King Arthur will never displease a soldier, but the quiddity of ends and prima materia will hardly agree with a corselet. So he says that the epic hero Orlando Furioso, Ariosto, or King Arthur, these heroes, poems or epics written on these heroes will always satisfy a soldier, because such noble warlike heroes are described here. But scholastic philosophy or terminology will never make him happy. Even Turks and Tartars are delighted with poets. Homer, a Greek, flourished before Greece flourished, and if to a slight conjecture a conjecture may be opposed, truly it may seem that as by him their learned men took almost their first light of knowledge. So Homer wrote poetry in the very primitive days, in the early days, before Greece flourished, before Greek civilization truly flourished. Much before that, Homer's poetry was written. But to the Greeks, it was the first divine light, the first light of knowledge. So Sidney says the importance of poetry is very great. Then he gives the example of Alexander, who always carried with him books, who by Plutarch is accounted of such virtue that fortune was not his guide but his footstool. This Alexander left his schoolmaster, leaving Aristotle behind him, but took dead Homer with him. So Aristotle was taught by, Alexander was taught by Aristotle. But when he went on his military projects, on his programs, projects of invasion and so on, empire building projects, he carried with him Homer. So that indicates the importance of poetry. So we will stop here. Do you have any questions?